There was a time when everything felt perfect. Mark had a loving wife, Julia, who was always by his side, and they had built a life together that he cherished. They had a beautiful home, supportive friends, and a stable routine. They were that couple friends referred to as relationship goals. For nearly 8 years, they were inseparable, the best of partners, and the parents to 2 wonderful kids. Mark always thought he'd be able to trust Julia with anything. Mark worked as a senior executive in a consulting firm, and while his job kept him busy, he'd never let his family feel neglected. He often took Julia and the kids on trips, showered them with surprises, and cherished those quiet evenings when it was just them at home, together. There were even occasional, over-the-top gifts, a small token, he thought, for the life they were building. So, when his company needed him to fly to New York for a week-long business trip, he thought nothing of it. He arranged for a stay at a high-end hotel, as they often hosted their clients there. Everything was planned out meticulously. Mark wanted to close this deal successfully so he could return home and surprise Julia with a romantic getaway he'd been planning for months. They hadn't had much time alone lately, and he was determined to change that. However, something strange happened the night before he left. Julia, usually a calm and steady presence, seemed unusually enthusiastic. She was almost animated. She encouraged him to enjoy himself, to have a good time. And when he was just about to leave for the airport, she gave him a deep, passionate kiss and whispered, "Don't worry about a thing here. I'll handle everything." It felt nice at the moment. He drove to the airport with a smile on his face, looking forward to their reunion and already envisioning the happiness of telling her about the trip. But on the flight, the enthusiasm Julia had shown started to feel strange. He pushed the thought away. Julia was his rock, his anchor, the person he trusted more than anyone in the world. Mark dismissed it as his own paranoia. He'd been working hard. Maybe he was just stressed. Mark decided to text her when he landed, just to let her know he'd arrived safely. And to reassure himself too, he supposed. Yet as the days passed, Julia's responses were sparse, her tone distant. When he tried to call her, she either missed the calls or responded with hurried texts that she was busy. There was a tightness forming in his chest, a familiar sense of doubt creeping in. He kept brushing it off, convincing himself he was overthinking. But something felt off. The business trip was intense, and Mark had back-to-back meetings with clients and stakeholders. Yet, in the quiet moments, his mind kept drifting back to Julia. The silence from her was unsettling, like a whisper of something he didn't want to hear. By the third night, his anxiety had crept up to the point where he couldn't ignore it. He decided to give her a call, late in the evening, hoping she'd be free. The phone rang, echoing in the empty hotel room, and went to voicemail. He tried again, and still, no answer. At that moment, he felt a pang of fear, something that had never struck him this hard before. She'd always been responsive, and he knew her routine well. This silence felt wrong, and he was beginning to think that her avoidance was not just about being busy. The next morning, he tried again, texting her to check in. Finally, Julia replied, but with a strange, vague message about being caught up with some things and a promise to catch up later. She seemed almost too eager to end the conversation. Feeling uneasy, Mark went to his meetings and tried to drown himself in work. His colleagues noticed his distraction, but he forced a smile and focused, hoping this tension would fade. That night, he called home again. This time, one of his kids answered. They sounded cheerful but hinted at something unusual. "Mommy had a big party today. There were so many people." Mark's heart sank. He hadn't known about any party. His kids babbled on about people with fancy clothes and lots of balloons. It felt surreal, like he was hearing about a life he wasn't part of. When he finally asked to talk to Julia, there was a brief pause. She got on the line with a laugh that felt forced. She brushed off his questions about the party, saying it was just a small gathering with a few friends, nothing to worry about. The sinking feeling returned, stronger now. Mark knew his wife, and he knew when she was hiding something. Her laughter, her overly casual tone. It felt wrong. The conversation ended quickly, but Mark stayed up late, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that there was a reasonable explanation. But doubt had set in, and with it, a quiet, gnawing anger. The rest of Mark's business trip was a blur. He went through the motions, attending meetings, closing deals, shaking hands, all while feeling like he was on the edge of some dark realization. The more he thought about that small gathering Julia had mentioned, the more questions surfaced in his mind. Why hadn't she told him about it before he left? And why did their child say it was such a big event? The final day of his trip arrived, and Mark decided to fly back earlier than planned, hoping to ease his mind by simply being home. He texted Julia to let her know he'd be arriving in the evening, but she didn't reply. Frustrated, he checked his messages and noticed she hadn't been active on any social media since the day of the mysterious party. Normally, Julia was a chronic poster, sharing snippets of their lives and pictures of the kids. But now, total silence. Mark's suspicion grew stronger with each passing hour. When his plane finally touched down, he drove straight home, his pulse racing as he imagined the relief of seeing his family. He parked in the driveway and noticed a few things immediately. The lawn was a mess, bottles and cups were scattered near the bushes, and there were remnants of confetti on the walkway. It looked nothing like the small gathering Julia had described. As he walked through the front door, he felt the tension in his chest tighten. The house was eerily quiet. He found Julia in the living room, curled up on the couch, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the TV. She looked up, visibly startled. "You're home early," she stammered, a brief flash of something. Was it guilt? Flickering across her face. Mark forced a smile, though his mind was racing. "Yeah, thought it'd be a nice surprise. How are things here? You had a party, right?" Julia's eyes flicked down, and she hesitated. "Oh yeah, just a little thing with a few friends. Nothing much," she said, too quickly. But Mark had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The confetti, the bottles, the mess. And he knew her too well. He could hear the tremor in her voice. She was hiding something. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words. He wanted to confront her right then, to demand the truth. But something held him back. Instead, he nodded, keeping his voice even. "Must have been fun. You'll have to tell me all about it later." He leaned in, kissed her on the cheek, and felt her flinch ever so slightly. It confirmed what he'd feared. Julia was hiding something bigger than a party. Mark barely slept that night. He lay beside Julia, listening to her breathing, while his mind replayed every strange detail of the past week. Why would she have a party like that without telling him? What reason could there be, other than? The next morning, he woke early, eager to investigate before she stirred. He went to the living room and started to pick up the remnants of the party. It was all so extravagant. He found napkins embossed with gold foil, an empty champagne bottle that was far more expensive than what he and Julia typically kept in the house. As he sifted through the trash, an odd object caught his eye, a single, long-stemmed red rose left wilting on the kitchen counter. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The rose didn't belong here. It felt like the calling card of someone else, someone who had walked through his home like it was theirs. He was certain Julia would never think to buy something so flashy. This rose was deliberate, a symbol he couldn't ignore. Returning to the mess, he noticed a receipt crumpled on the table. He opened it with shaking hands. It was a catering receipt from a high-end restaurant he recognized, one he and Julia had only been to once because of the price. The catering bill alone was astronomical. He felt his stomach drop as he scanned the receipt. $1,000 for champagne, $500 for lobster, $300 for floral arrangements. It added up to over $10,000, a sum they simply wouldn't spend on a small gathering with friends. As he placed the receipt back on the table, he heard the floorboards creak. He looked up and saw Julia in the doorway, watching him, her face pale. "You're up early," she said, her voice unsteady. She took a cautious step toward him, eyes flicking nervously between the receipt in his hand and his face. "Yeah, I wanted to help with the cleanup," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, even casual. "Looks like it was quite the party." Julia swallowed hard, her expression wavering. "It was just a little celebration," she replied, crossing her arms defensively. "I didn't think you'd mind." "Oh, I don't mind." He forced a smile that felt foreign on his face. "Just curious about the cost of it all, that's all." Her face turned red, and she looked down at her feet. Well, a few friends chipped in. They wanted it to be nice. I thought it would be okay. He felt anger simmering beneath his skin but held it back. This wasn't the time to unleash his suspicions. He wanted to know the full story before confronting her. If he acted now, he feared she would cover up whatever she was hiding, and he'd be left in the dark, doubting himself and his own instincts. Instead, he nodded slowly, keeping his voice level. I see. Well, I guess it's good to go all out once in a while. He reached down, pretending to gather the trash, but his mind was spinning. That evening, Mark decided to take a risk. He set up his laptop and opened the shared cloud account they used for family photos. He searched the date of the party, just in case she'd taken photos and backed them up without thinking. To his shock, there were over 100 photos from that night. He clicked on the first one, heart pounding. There was Julia, looking radiant in a dress he'd never seen before, her arm wrapped around a man he didn't recognize. They were standing close, smiling at each other in a way that was undeniably intimate. Each subsequent photo told the same story. Julia with her arm around this stranger, laughing, sharing champagne, toasting with the guests. In one particularly damning photo, the man was leaning down, his face inches from hers, as though whispering something private. Julia's expression was soft, her gaze locked on his with a look Mark knew all too well. The warmth and intimacy he saw between them were unmistakable. Mark felt his heart shatter into pieces. Mark's hands trembled as he scrolled through the photos, each one worse than the last. With every click, he watched his marriage disintegrate, pixel by pixel, replaced by an image he could barely recognize. There she was, the woman he devoted his life to, looking at this stranger with a warmth and adoration that should have belonged to him. He stared at their faces, that magnetic pull between them so obvious it felt like a slap. The photos documented everything in painful detail. He saw familiar faces, Julia's friends from her yoga class, a few mutual acquaintances, even a couple of his co-workers who must have been invited without his knowledge. A wave of nausea washed over him as he realized that many people in his life had attended this party, witnessed Julia with this other man, and hadn't thought to tell him. How many of them knew? How many had been hiding this from him? Just as he was about to close the laptop in despair, one photo stopped him cold. It was a wide shot of the party scene. The living room transformed into an upscale, glittering space, far more elegant than anything he'd ever seen in their home. And in the center of it all, his children. His son and daughter stood off to the side, watching their mother and the stranger with uncertain expressions, as if they sensed something was wrong but couldn't understand it. Seeing his children in the middle of it all broke something deep inside him. It was one thing for Julia to betray him, but to involve their kids, to let them see her embrace another man under their father's roof, it was unforgivable. His heart twisted painfully as he imagined what his son and daughter must have felt, watching their mother dote on a stranger as if he belonged there. Mark knew he couldn't confront her about the photos, not yet. He needed more than just a gallery of images if he wanted to protect himself and his kids from whatever fallout lay ahead. He would need proof, evidence that she crossed a line. If Julia had indeed had an affair, he wanted every last detail in his corner before confronting her. He didn't want a shouting match that would end with her deflecting, denying, and trying to twist this into a mistake or just a friend misunderstanding. No, he was going to prepare. Taking a deep breath, he copied the photos to a hidden drive and closed the laptop. He forced himself to move through the day as if nothing had changed, burying his fury and heartbreak under a mask of normalcy. Every time Julia looked at him, he had to fight the urge to confront her, to throw the truth in her face and watch her squirm. But he held back, reminding himself that patience would serve him better than rage. The next day, he reached out to a private investigator. Mark had no experience with this sort of thing and felt ashamed to be taking such a step. But the truth was a heavy burden, and he couldn't carry it alone. He needed someone who could dig deeper than he could, someone who would confirm what he suspected without the confusion of emotions clouding the facts. That evening, Julia was unusually warm, acting as if nothing was amiss, her tone almost flirtatious. She kissed his cheek when he got home, as if to erase the evidence of the party, her apparent lover, and the lies that had piled up in his absence. Mark played along, his silence heavy with the weight of secrets. Each passing minute only strengthened his resolve to stay calm, to bide his time, and to gather what he needed. The private investigator's reply came later that night. He would start immediately, and as Mark read that message, he felt a spark of hope amid the devastation. In the days that followed, Mark slipped into a routine of silent vigilance, each moment a quiet test of his patience. The private investigator would send him discreet updates every evening, each report a small piece of the puzzle he was constructing. The investigator confirmed that the man in the photos was named Ryan, a wealthy entrepreneur and, apparently, someone Julia had been involved with for a while. Mark's stomach churned with every new piece of information. Dinners at exclusive restaurants, weekend trips she disguised as girls' nights out, and, worst of all, hints that Ryan had become a regular presence in their home while Mark was away. Mark's anger, once a fiery burst, simmered into something colder and sharper, a controlled blade honed by betrayal. Despite everything, he kept his demeanor calm around Julia, refusing to give away the fact that he knew. She'd become more relaxed since his return, almost smug, as if she'd pulled off the perfect cover and was satisfied with herself. It hurt, more than he wanted to admit, to see her so nonchalant. But he kept playing his part, knowing it was essential if he wanted to see this through. One evening, as they sat at dinner with the kids, Julia mentioned in passing that she'd be going out the next night for a yoga retreat. Mark nodded, acting interested, though he knew exactly where she'd be. The private investigator had told him of a luxury hotel reservation in her name, complete with a spa package and a dinner for two. This wasn't a yoga retreat. It was a romantic getaway with Ryan, yet another betrayal wrapped in a lie. The next night, Mark made a plan. Once Julia left, he waited until she was gone and then arranged for the kids to stay with a close friend. He had never shared his suspicions with anyone. He didn't want the embarrassment of the truth spilling out before he was ready. But tonight, he knew he needed to see her deception firsthand, to have his own proof that he could no longer deny. After dropping the kids off, he drove to the hotel where Julia had made the reservation. The investigator had given him all the details, including the room number and a time when she and Ryan were expected to arrive. Mark's hands gripped the wheel tightly as he parked, nerves frayed yet sharpened by purpose. This was it. He needed this final, undeniable confirmation. As he made his way to the hotel, he felt both calm and hollow, as if he were preparing for a meeting rather than walking into the wreckage of his marriage. He walked into the lobby, his heart thudding as he took in the opulent surroundings. The chandeliers glittered, the polished floors gleamed, and everything seemed to mock him with its elegance. He saw them as soon as he reached the bar area. Julia was laughing, her face bright and open in a way he hadn't seen in years, leaning into Ryan with an intimacy that turned Mark's stomach. They clinked glasses, sharing a private joke, completely unaware of his presence. For a brief, terrible moment, he felt like he was the intruder, the outsider in his own life. Mark fought back the urge to confront them then and there. Instead, he pulled out his phone and discreetly took photos. They were tangible proof, evidence he could use later. He watched them for a few minutes longer, each second searing his heart, before he turned and left, unable to bear it any longer. Back in his car, he sat in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on him. There was no more denial, no more wondering. The truth was now a heavy, undeniable fact, and he felt both devastated and relieved. It was over, and there was no going back. He returned home, sitting in the empty house as the night stretched on, replaying everything in his mind. He pictured Julia's smile, the light in her eyes as she looked at Ryan, and he realized with a painful clarity that she was gone. The woman he loved was gone, replaced by someone he no longer knew or trusted. The private investigator's call came through later that night, confirming everything Mark had seen with his own eyes. The investigator offered a few legal contacts, sensing that Mark would want the next steps laid out clearly. Mark thanked him, his voice low, the words barely audible. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, but a strange calm settled over him. The pieces were all in place. Now, it was his turn to act. The following morning, Mark woke to an eerie quietness, the weight of everything pressing on him with fresh intensity. He knew he had to hold it together for the kids, to keep things as normal as possible until he could finalize his plan. With all the evidence secured, Mark began researching the legal side, reaching out to one of the divorce attorneys recommended by the investigator. His call was brief and to the point. The attorney, sensing Mark's urgency, scheduled a meeting for later that week. In the meantime, he advised Mark to keep documenting everything: texts, bank statements, any evidence that showed how Julia had spent their shared finances on her affair. The attorney also warned him not to confront her directly. Not yet. The words felt harsh, but Mark understood the logic. In a moment of rage, he could tip his hand, and she might try to protect herself in ways that could complicate his case. With the legal groundwork in progress, Mark turned his focus to something even more important: the kids. The betrayal was like a fissure running through his life, but his children were his anchor, his reason for holding it together. The thought of them being part of this mess made him sick. They didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of their mother's choices. No matter what happened, he resolved to protect them from the fallout. That evening, Julia returned home, her face glowing from her evening with Ryan. She didn't even try to hide her happiness, though she made an effort to appear casual. Mark caught a whiff of expensive cologne on her as she walked by, and it took all his self-control not to say something. "How was the retreat?" he asked, his voice steady, hiding the storm that churned inside him. She hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "Oh, it was good," she said, grabbing a glass of water and looking away. "Very relaxing. Just what I needed." He forced a nod, the bitterness barely contained. She was lying so effortlessly, slipping into the role of the faithful wife as if the other Julia, the one who laughed with Ryan, shared private jokes, leaned into him with that familiar warmth, didn't exist. Mark could barely stand to look at her, yet he kept up his calm facade, remembering the attorney's advice. A few days passed like this, each one feeling like a strained performance. Mark went through his routine, tending to the kids, acting as if nothing had changed. Inside, he felt like a stranger in his own home, drifting through a life that felt increasingly surreal. Every time he saw Julia, the urge to confront her flared up, but he pushed it down, reminding himself of the bigger picture. Finally, the day of his attorney meeting arrived. Mark felt his heart pound as he sat across from the lawyer in a sleek office filled with law books and awards on the walls. The attorney, a seasoned professional, listened to Mark's story with a calm, analytical gaze. He took careful notes, nodding at each detail. When Mark showed him the photos and financial records, the lawyer's expression shifted slightly, a glint of determination replacing the neutral professionalism. "You've got a strong case here," he said, his tone firm. "The evidence you have, photos, records of spending from joint accounts, even the catering receipt. It's enough to demonstrate financial infidelity, which could influence the division of assets." Mark felt a surge of relief, though it was tinged with sadness. He'd never imagined he'd find himself sitting in a lawyer's office, planning a divorce. His mind kept flashing back to happier times with Julia, the life they'd built, the dreams they'd shared. But those memories felt hollow now, overshadowed by the betrayal she'd allowed into their lives. The lawyer continued, explaining the process and the options available. "We can go one of two ways," he said. "If she's cooperative, we can try mediation to settle things amicably. But given the financial implications of her affair, we could also pursue a stronger legal stance, protecting your assets and your rights as a father." Mark didn't hesitate. "I want to protect my kids," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." The lawyer nodded. "Understood. The next step is serving her with the papers. This can be done discreetly or directly. We'll also outline an agreement for custody, one that ensures stability for the children." Mark left the office that day with a sense of grim determination. The path was clearer now, and while the hurt still ran deep, he felt the strength of a plan taking shape. This wasn't just about ending his marriage. It was about reclaiming his life and protecting his children. For the first time since the night he'd seen those photos, he felt a glimmer of control over his own future. Mark spent the next few days meticulously gathering anything else that could strengthen his case. He documented every suspicious charge Julia made, every time she came home late, and every moment she spent texting when she thought he wasn't looking. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he knew he had to stay calm and steady. The moment he tipped his hand, she'd be on guard, and he couldn't afford that. The attorney informed him that everything was set for the papers to be served the following Monday. As the date approached, Mark's anxiety mixed with a strange calm. He knew that once Julia received those papers, everything would change. She'd no longer be the wife he was fighting to trust. She'd be the woman he was fighting to leave. When Monday arrived, Mark's heart pounded as he waited at home. Julia was out with the kids, and he knew that when she returned, she'd have the divorce papers in hand. He paced the living room, mentally preparing himself for the confrontation he knew would come. And then, he heard the car in the driveway. Julia entered, the kids trailing behind her, their laughter echoing in the hallway. She was smiling, chatting with them as if everything were normal. But the moment she saw him standing there, her face shifted, her eyes wary. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tense. "Kids, why don't you go play in your room?" Mark said softly, trying to keep his tone gentle. They glanced between their parents, sensing the tension, but eventually nodded and left the room. Once they were gone, Mark turned to Julia. Her hands were clenched around the divorce papers she'd clearly found in the mailbox. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and perhaps fear. "What is this?" she demanded, waving the papers in the air. "It's exactly what it looks like, Julia," Mark replied, his voice cold and steady. "I know about everything. The affair, the money you spent, the lies." For a moment, Julia looked stunned. She opened her mouth as if to deny it, but something in his expression stopped her. She dropped her gaze, her shoulders sagging as her facade crumbled. "Mark, I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was a mistake, Stop," he interrupted, holding up his hand. "I don't want your apologies. I don't want your excuses. I gave you everything, Julia. My love, my trust, a home. And you took it all for granted." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a fleeting moment, he almost felt sorry for her. But then he remembered the look on her face when she was with Ryan, the way she'd hidden everything so effortlessly. His heart hardened. "We're done, Julia. I'll fight for custody. I'll fight for what's fair. But as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing left here for us." The days following the confrontation were a blur of tension and quiet arguments. Julia moved into the guest room, and they communicated as little as possible. Mark had already explained to the kids, in the gentlest way he could, that Mom and Dad would be living in separate houses soon. They were confused and sad, but he assured them they'd still see both parents. Julia, for her part, had gone from anger to bargaining to pleading. She begged him to consider counseling, even claiming she cut all ties with Ryan. But Mark's mind was set. Too much had been broken to repair, and every attempt she made to apologize only reminded him of the lies she'd told. One evening, as they both sat at opposite ends of the dinner table in strained silence, Julia looked up at him, her face shadowed with regret. "Do you really hate me that much, Mark?" she whispered. He paused, surprised by her vulnerability. Did he hate her? No, but he didn't love her either. Not anymore. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but I can't forgive you either." The divorce proceedings moved forward, with each step feeling more like an inevitable march toward the end of an era. The lawyer's firm was efficient, and with all the evidence Mark had gathered, he was set to come out with a fair share of their assets, and, more importantly, primary custody of the kids. One evening, his lawyer called with unexpected news. Ryan had been subpoenaed to testify about his relationship with Julia, and instead of staying loyal, Ryan had decided to cooperate with Mark's legal team. Mark was stunned. Apparently, the thrill had worn off for Ryan, who'd only recently started dating someone else and had little interest in protecting Julia's reputation. When Mark told her about Ryan's betrayal, Julia's face crumpled. It was a moment of poetic justice, yet Mark felt only a hollow satisfaction. The damage had already been done, and now Julia was left without even the man she'd sacrificed her family for. As the court date loomed, Mark spent more time with his kids, focusing on creating happy memories amid the chaos. He took them camping, planned movie nights, and encouraged them to ask questions about the changes happening. He didn't want them to feel like they had to pick sides, but he made it clear that they'd be staying with him for most of the time. One night, as he was tucking them in, his daughter looked up at him with big, earnest eyes. "Daddy, why is Mommy sad all the time now?" Mark's heart ached, but he forced a gentle smile. "Sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes, sweetie. And when they do, it can take a while for everyone to feel okay again. But you don't have to worry. I'll always be here for you." The day in court was long and exhausting, but when the verdict came, Mark felt a wave of relief. He'd been granted primary custody, with Julia having visitation rights. He'd also been awarded a larger share of the assets, given the evidence of her affair and financial irresponsibility. Julia was visibly crushed by the outcome, but Mark felt an odd sense of closure. It wasn't the happy ending he'd once imagined, but it was an end, and that was enough. After the divorce was finalized, Mark took some time to reflect. He felt a mixture of freedom and grief, a strange emptiness where his marriage had once been. Friends and family offered support, inviting him over for dinners, urging him to get back into old hobbies. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life, finding strength in his independence and in the love of his kids. Julia's life, he learned through mutual friends, had unraveled quickly. Ryan had moved on, and her attempts at dating had only deepened her loneliness. She reached out to Mark occasionally, trying to talk or ask for forgiveness, but he kept his distance, knowing that he needed space to truly heal. Months turned into a year, and Mark found a new rhythm. He met new friends, focused on his work, and created a stable, happy environment for his children. Occasionally, he'd catch a glimpse of Julia at a school event or a mutual friends gathering, and though he felt a pang of sadness, it was less painful each time. His friends encouraged him to start dating again, and after some hesitation, he agreed to meet someone for coffee. It was nerve-wracking, but it also reminded him of the possibility of new beginnings, of finding someone who might treat him with the respect and loyalty he deserved. One evening, as he was tucking the kids into bed, his son wrapped his arms around his neck and whispered, "Daddy, you're my hero." Mark's throat tightened, and he hugged his son back, feeling a wave of gratitude for the resilience they'd found together. He'd lost a marriage but gained a deeper, stronger relationship with his children. As he turned out the lights and closed the door, Mark felt a strange, peaceful acceptance wash over him. Life hadn't gone the way he'd planned, but he'd built something new, something honest, and that was more than enough.